So, you want to get caught up for Destiny 2's last expansion. Well, not the last expansion, but you get what I mean. The last one in this saga. Maybe you haven't played since launch, maybe you haven't played for this season, maybe you've been playing this season and you're just trying to catch up on the story or the character progression and get ready for the final shape, and even some stuff for Pantheon that launches this week. Just some quick self-promo. My name's Ponderer. If you like this content or dislike this content, let me know with the like or dislike bar. And if you have any comments or feedback, let me know down below. And if you want to see more, please subscribe. And without further ado, let's get into it. First and foremost, whether you're a returning player, haven't played for a while, or you've been playing, I would get caught up with the story and the narrative. So players who haven't played since launch, you're looking at campaigns starting from Shadowkeep, leading into Beyond Light, the Witch Queen expansion, and then obviously Lightfall. These are all in the game still without any issues. Forsaken, unfortunately, does have most of its content, if not all of its content, left out outside of the one mission you can access via the directory. Additionally, the seasonal storylines for the last 4 seasons of Lightfall are all available in-game, so running through their story content is pretty straightforward, though it will have you running through a lot of steps and a lot of ritual activities, so if you're not keen on doing that in-game, you can always find videos that will explain those storylines. With regards to getting your character caught up, there are quite a few things you should be doing if you're looking to get yourself ready for the campaign of Final Shape, or for Pantheon that releases this week, or for the contest mode raid for the Final Shape that launches on June 7th. Starting with Pantheon. Pantheon is a raid boss gauntlet. It starts with 4 bosses week 1, and every week afterwards it adds 1 boss, and the power differential between your power and the encounter increases by 5. So by the end of the Pantheon event, the final week encounter will be -20, which is equivalent to contest mode difficulty. So in getting prepared to complete this and get the emblems, the title, and the seal associated with Pantheon, you're going to want to have a full suite of armor and weapons. One of the last situations you may want to find yourself in when competing in the Pantheon or in the Final Shape's raid or legendary difficulty campaign is hitting an encounter where you don't have the tools you may need, something like a weapon catalyst or just having the right weapon in general. So any weapons or exotic catalysts that you don't have now, I would go and do those if you have the option. Something like the Shuro Chi checkpoint in Last Wish, or the underside of the jumping room with a sphere in the Whisper of the Worm mission, which has Shadow Thrall that infinitely spawn, are great places to farm kills. As well, even something like, say, Onslaught has a lot of enemy density that might make it useful for you to farm weapon catalysts or weapon levels for crafted weapons. Especially with regards to Last Wish, with something like, say, a bait-and-switch Reconstruction Apex Predator rocket launcher, something like that is a lot more easily obtainable this season given that you do have the wishes available from Mara Sov. Doing these is pretty straightforward. Completing ritual activities or other encounters makes it pretty easy to get some red borders and complete some patterns you may need to complete from Last Wish as an example. Additionally, the Brave Arsenal weapons from Onslaught are really good, some of them more so than others for endgame completion of activities like raids. Just as well, if you find yourself wanting something like, say, a Zauli's Bane from Crota, or a Reconstruction Briar's Contempt from something like the Root of Nightmares, I would start working on getting those patterns now, so by the end of the Pantheon, towards the final weeks, you should have crafted versions of these available, should you need them, in the harder difficulty weeks of Pantheon. Just as well, the Season Pass does have some deep side harmonizers available, so getting those and using those on different weapons you may want crafted variants of could help save you some time in having to rerun old raids. Regarding this current season, we are about 4 months into it, which means that if you haven't already, you should probably max it out and make sure your seasonal artifact mods are available, especially for the Pantheon's later weeks. The artifact this season is going away obviously at the beginning of the final shape, so this is really just a Pantheon relevant step, but if you're looking at clearing Pantheon with something like, say, the later mods in the artifact, or clearing older content if you're a solo flawless dungeon enjoyer like myself, you should go and do that content now with the mods from this current season. Currently, we have access to mods like Solo Operative and the Argent Ordnance mod, which makes doing damage in a solo environment or with rockets much more potent than, say, doing it without them. Additionally, and sort of hand in hand with getting prepped with weapons, is getting your builds ready. We obviously have the loadout section now with the introduction of Lightfall, and it's been a godsend for build swapping mid-encounter, or without having to necessarily manually flip over artifacts and aspects. And you'll thank yourself later for having gotten these builds up to date and set up ahead of time should you find yourself needing to switch things up. I can foresee a lot of frustration during the raid race for Final Shape, the later weeks of Pantheon, or even the legendary campaign for Final Shape, where some people who haven't had these prepped ahead of time will have to manually swap over their fragments and aspects, getting their different builds to a place where they can actually be used for this content. Destiny Item Manager does have downtime following the updates to the game, and this is certainly true of the expansion updates as well. I know in the past we've seen some downtime for Dim following the release of Lightfall, so you may want to have that stuff ready ahead of time as well, because this may not be an option for you should you have to pull things from your vault into a character's loadout. And especially for playing to do build swaps during encounters. Something like, say, a Titan who runs Pyre Gills for damage on his Burning Maul DPS super, but wants to run Syntheseps or Wormgod's Caress for the increased melee damage on something like, say, the Bonk Hammer. Getting these ready ahead of time can really make you more efficient and alleviate some potential added time. And just as well in relation to builds, if you have the time, you should farm Artifice Armor. Now it's not 100% needed, as the bonus is minimal, but you can get some extra stats for free, so I would try to get these and use the ghost mods for stat targeting and farm the stat rolls you want with Artifice Armor slots on the weekly rotated dungeon. RNG willing, you should have a nice set of armor after some runs that will give you more flexibility in what you can equip if you say need to use one slot for an exotic, but that slot has a way better resilience roll in a legendary item than say the exotic you're using, and switching that slot out would put you at lower than max resilience. Having Artifice Armor on other slots could make the difference in getting you to those higher tiers of resilience or recovery should you need them. And then lastly, specific for Pantheon, I would rerun the old raids. Getting familiar with the mechanics is going to save you a lot of time and headache having to pull up a guide online or on YouTube and having to relearn the mechanics mid-encounter. This will be especially useful for two places in particular, the Vow of the Disciple and Last Wish, particularly the symbols in both, and especially for completing Riven legitimately on Last Wish. I typically pull up a chart on my second monitor for the symbols for both Last Wish and Vow of the Disciple, as I do have trouble remembering all of them. So you may find that useful, but it's still likely to be just as useful to rerun the old raids and get refamiliarized with the symbols and what their names are. And as I mentioned before, you should rerun Last Wish's Riven encounter and learn how to do it legitimately. Now we don't know this for sure, but it would not surprise me at all if Bungie's Pantheon version of the Riven encounter that arrives as the 7th encounter in Pantheon removes the joining allies cheese that we've all been running for the last 6 years, and Bungie forces players to do it as intended. And considering how ubiquitous this strategy has become, I would be surprised if more than say 10% of the community that runs LFG's Last Wish raids actually knows how to complete the encounter legitimately. I myself haven't run Riven legitimately in probably over 4 years, as the cheese has been so useful and commonplace. Now I mentioned that Riven is the 7th encounter that we should see in the Pantheon, and that's because we do have some API leaks that give us an idea of what the boss order should be, starting from week 1 and the subsequent weeks following it. The first 4 bosses that will appear in Pantheon based on the API leaks are Golgoroth from King's Fall, Caretaker from Vow, Zao Arc or the Planets Encounter from Root of Nightmares, and then Atrax from Deepstone Crypt. And in the subsequent weeks following the first 4, where one will be added each week, the 5th encounter should be Oryx from King's Fall, the 6th being Rolk from Vow of the Disciple, the 7th being Riven from Last Wish, and the final boss being Nezarec from the Root of Nightmares. So if you're looking to get prepared, you could target running those specific raids to get ready for all the encounters you'll find, which would mean rerunning King's Fall, Root of Nightmares, Deepstone Crypt, Last Wish, and Vow of the Disciple. No encounters from Vogue or Crota's End were scraped from the API, so those likely aren't to appear in the Pantheon. And shout out to Harry2533 on Twitter for compiling this. This is obviously information we have from somebody scraping the API, so it's subject to change and could appear different from what appears live on the game when it launches on the 30th and the subsequent weeks. But we do know that some things are going to change. Bungie has said with regards to Pantheon to expect some twists with encounters, so not everything will be the same. Whether that's new champion spawns, where they weren't previously, or entirely new mechanics, though I expect less of that for these encounters. Expect some surprises and not exact one-to-one variants of the encounters though, from the way they exist in the game currently. Now moving on to some more focused Final Shape raid prep, though this will be useful if you're prepping for Pantheon or for anything else coming to the game. With regards to the power cap for Final Shape's raid day 1, we do know what that is now based on the last twid from April 25th. The power cap for this raid will be 1965. So, if you're looking to get raid prepped as efficiently as possible, you should run the Legendary campaign for the Final Shape once that goes live. The Final Shape's Legendary campaign is going to reward people who complete it with a 1960 powered set of armor, which means you can infuse that into your current armor upon completion and you'll be just 5 away. So outside of some powerful and pinnacle drops following the completion of the campaign, you should be as close to, if not above, the power cap of 1965 and be fully ready for the contest mode raid. Additionally, you're going to want to get all the fragments and aspects for the other 2 subclasses in with regards to Stasis and Strand, and that's for 2 different reasons. Number 1, these may be good subclasses to use in both Pantheon and the Final Shapes raid, and could be the right tool for you to bring to an encounter. Additionally, with the introduction of Prismatic in the Final Shape, it's unclear just how exactly those are all going to work together. We have seen some build screens with some fragments from the Stasis and Strand subclasses, as well as the other Light 3.0 subclasses, so having all the fragments and aspects should give you all the options that you might find yourself needing to use, should you decide to go with the Prismatic subclass. And those are the major things I would get done for the Final Shape. Now I do have some honorable mentions that I would look at doing if you find the time, but aren't necessarily necessary. And those are, in no particular order, clearing up any old quests, and then also getting seasonal title completions before June 3rd, as the last 4 titles from the seasonal content that's been available from Lightfall will be unobtainable once the June 4th expansion launch goes live. And finally, of course, bounty farming. Now I've not personally done a lot of this in previous season or expansion launches, as it's mostly necessary for the artifact, but that is the wildcard with this raid race, the artifact. Now we know there is an artifact with a new episode, Echoes, and you can see it here in the last Vidoc we got on April 9th from Bungie's showcase of the Final Shape gameplay. But it's unclear when we're going to get this artifact in-game, which is why this is something I'm sort of unsure about recommending. Now, the raid for Final Shape launches on June 7th, and the episode entitled Echoes launches on the following Tuesday, June 11th. Typically, we only get artifacts at season launches, so it's possible we won't actually get this artifact for this episode until that Tuesday, the 11th. And with a 48-hour contest window, which we do know is 48 hours and not 24, so this would mean that by the end of the contest mode completion, we wouldn't even have access to the artifact, and thus bounty farming for the mods wouldn't necessarily be useful. Now, you could bounty farm and then hold on to your bounties up to the 11th and then use them, but assuming we get the artifact before the 11th, then bounty farming will have been useful, as you can max out your artifact or get a head start on maxing it out and get the access to the mods from the artifact. But if it's not live until the 11th, you may only find this useful if you, say, want to have earlier access to the mods starting from the 11th onwards, if you, say, are just trying to get a normal clear of the raid and not necessarily work on a contest mode completion. Just some quick reminders, Pantheon does leave on June 3rd, as do the shiny variants of the Brave Arsenal weapons, so while you'll still be able to get the Brave Arsenal weapons in non-shiny variants following the Final Shape's release, if you want the actual shiny variants, you're going to want to have gotten those beforehand. And as always, if you have any comments for me, feedback, whether it's liking or disliking the video, please let me know, and if you want to see more, please subscribe. That's going to do it for me, guys. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.